This is a story from Tales from the Hinterland by Melissa Albert. This story is titled The House Under the Stairwell. On a bright day, at the edge of an overgrown garden, three sisters pricked their fingers on a briar and let their blood fall to the earth. Below the briar, it was said, lay the body of a bride who died on her wedding night. She was called the Wicked Wife. If you let your blood drop over the briar that covered her grave, she came to you in dreams to share a vision of the one you'd marry. The eldest of the sisters, Isabel, had suffered a broken engagement. In her eagerness to forget the man she loved, she became determined to visit the grave, and her sisters followed after. As their blood disappeared into the briar, the first cold breath of winter came from the mouth of the woods, snow rattling in it like loose teeth. The girls shivered, drawing bloody fingers into their cloaks, and turned their backs to the trees. That night, tucked up in bed, they dreamed. The youngest sister smiled over her breakfast table at a man with wise eyes, strong hands, and a rambling house filled with beautiful things. The middle sister walked with a broad-shouldered man through an orchard. He plucked a fruit off a pear tree and gave it to her. Isabel, however, had a stranger dream. As her sisters smiled in their sleep, she fretted and turned, her pillow too hot and her blanket stifling. In the days since her jilting, she dreamed only of the man who'd humiliated her. Would she fall asleep tonight and dream of him still? After a long, restless time, she left her bed and moved to the window. There she watched the snow fall, running the fingers of one hand over the place on the other where an engagement ring had sat. When she turned from the window, a woman stood between her and her bed. Moonlight ran through the woman in 1,000 silver spear points. Her hair was red, her dress was white, her neck was crooked. She wore a wooden mask painted with the golden face of a lioness. "You wish to hear of your husband?" Her voice made a cold music. The shush of wind in the bare branches, the tapping of a dead girl's wedding shoes. "Am I asleep?" Isabel whispered. "Are you the wicked wife?" Shadows, shaped like fingers, crawled up the woman's skirts. She took them away. "You wish to hear of your husband," she said once more. "I'll take you to meet him this very night." From behind Isabel came a hissing giggle, like cold water on hot coals, and two figures moved to flank her. They were small as children and oddly hunched, their bodies dressed in yellow. They too wore wooden masks painted with the faces of beautiful girls. Isabel looked at their curving backs and the ears that twitched over the tops of their masks, fox-red and pointed. She looked at the mournful column of the white-dressed bride and thought of her lost fiancé, set to marry a girl he just met. "Take me to my husband," she said. The fox girls bobbed around her, chittering with laughter. They ran a bitten berry over her lips and slipped satin dancing shoes onto her feet. Then they led her from the room, down the hall, to an unfamiliar stair. Its steps were polished stone, descending past walls hung with paintings rich as marzipan, where ladies danced in gilded rooms and gentlemen hunted in jeweled forests. Isabel walked down and down until her feet ached. The stairs ended at last in the middle of a rambling moor covered thickly with snow. There was no sky here, but a roof of earth, heavy coils of roots running through it. Moths larger than men perched on the roots with their wings open wide, casting a delicate glow. In the distance stood a house with light shining through every window, and before it a grove of gold and silver trees. A masked figure waited beneath each tree, limbs too long and fingers hidden in dark gloves. Above their mask, each painted with a man's face, stood wiry gray wolf ears. The nearest bowed to Isabel and offered his hand. I'm dreaming, she told herself as she took it. I'm fast asleep. The wolf-eared dancers spun her about the grove, passing her from one to the next. The snow bloomed red as her slippers shredded and her bare feet bloodied. Snowflakes fell from the metal trees, clotting in her lashes and melting on her tongue. Dizzy with dancing and the pain in her feet, Isabel caught herself against the chest of a figure taller than the rest. The eyes behind his mask were amber around a dull black pupil, his ears tawny as a cat's. His arms came around her, gloved fingers pressing bruises into the small of her back. The scent of him was old bedclothes and vetiver. Beneath the drifting snowflakes, bathed in pale mothlight, they danced. After a time, he dipped his mouth to her ear. What heartbreak are you running from, that you found your way to me? Happy women do not walk beneath the stairwell. His voice made every part of her prickle with cold caution. My heartbreak is not so great, she said faintly. When I wake from this dream, it will be half healed. The lion-eyed figure laughed, an awful rumble that ran below his skin and caught behind the unyielding smile of his mask. Do you pretend even now that you're sleeping? Here, let me wake you up. Pain burst in her back, 10 fine points of it, as she fixed fierce claws that stabbed and retreated. She gasped and staggered, and would have fallen if he did not hold her up, still turning, still moving her body through the dance. I think we understand each other now, he murmured. So hear this. All you see beneath the stairwell belongs to me. Every stone and stick of it passing into my land is free. It's leaving them that comes with a cost. It took Isabel 3 tries to catch her breath. What cost? Your hand in marriage. A high toll for one dance. Be patient, my unhappy love. We'll do more than dance on our wedding night. He spun her once more about his moth-lit dreamland, his trap baited with tales of the wicked wife. When he let her go, she stumbled to her knees, looking up at this shape traced against the earth and sky. His voice mocked her as he turned away. Hurry, my love, back to your maiden's bed. I'll claim you 1 year hence when the winter's first snow falls. The wolfmen were gone, and the fox-eared girls in their yellow clothes. Far overhead, the moths swooped like bats through the growing dark. The shining form of the wicked wife reappeared among the trees to hurry Isabel through the grove, over the moor, up and up the stairs. Pain glittered in her back and feet. The ghost's nearness chilled her. She felt half sick with cold when at last they reached the threshold of home. Her room was dark and smelled of ashes, and her sisters were lost to different dreams, which made them cry out in their sleep. She fell into the bed, her head a wilderness of briars, and mothlight, and masked men. The wicked wife lingered beside her, a shape almost lost in the brightening dark. Through a scream of exhaustion, Isabel spoke. What manner of monster are you to lead me to that place? The dead bride drifted a while before speaking. One made by the acts of men. I won't marry him, the girl murmured, already halfway to sleep. You will, the ghost replied. We always do. She stayed for a time as Isabel slept. Poor girl, she sighed. Poor girl, poor girl. Perhaps she was speaking of herself. In the morning, the youngest sister boasted of the rich man she'd met in her dreams. The middle sister spoke more quietly of her husband-to-be's handsome face and strong arms. When it was Isabel's turn, she told her sisters her sleep had been dreamless. I suppose you'll never marry, said the youngest, her face soft with pity. Isabel curled bloody toes beneath her blankets. Fiercely, she wished it to be true. Isabel burned the satin slippers. Her battered feet reknit themselves. but she could not forgive herself so easily. She was an eldest sister, and still she'd gotten herself caught in some creature's net. Away from the world beneath the stairwell, she began to calculate. She'd given no promises. She'd told herself. She'd eaten nothing, kissed no one. All she'd done was dance. But all that winter, the grove and the soother's tress held her in their grip. Her sleep was unsettled, opaque. She could not descend the stairs without an ache in her feet and a rising dread. She found herself misplacing things: a copper thimble, a bracelet of braided metal, a blue glove embroidered with darker blue forget-me-nots. Her distraction lasted until spring. The season's first green breath brought her back to herself, infected her with an appetite for open air. Perhaps she ventured to hope. Her night beneath the stairwell had never really happened. The wicked wife was just a tale, after all. Then her youngest sister came home from a dinner party with flushed cheeks. She gathered her sisters close and revealed that she'd met him, the man from her dream. She'd known him at once. He was as rich and handsome as she remembered, and he'd spent the entire evening by her side. The next day the man presented himself, speaking to their father before putting a ring on the girl's hand. Isabel blanched and smiled and congratulated her sister. Soon after that, the middle sister spied the man she'd seen in dreams at the market day. He wrapped her finger in a flower stem and promised a ring would come. Isabel wished her well in a voice frail as paper, and when she could manage it, she slipped away, back to the abandoned garden, where briars grew over the grave of the wicked wife. She paced among them, catching her skirts on their teeth and disturbing the bees. She was in danger, or she was a fool. She was cursed, or she was hunted by nothing but a night of dark dreaming. With one foot she walked a solid path, while the other trod in nightmare. She did not know which to believe in. Nothing for it but to take the knife from her boot, let it bite her finger, and watch her blood drop onto the briar. What a fool I've become, she lamented, to court a phantom twice. But her sleep that night was dreamless, as deep and dark as the sea. She rose from it with aching eyes. On the pillow beside her lay a wooden mask. It was carved from oak, its painted tiger stripes garish in the sun. Softly she lifted the thing, feeling its clumsy weight. Then she tossed it into the fire. It was better to know, she told herself, as the flames washed it to ash. Better than to waste her time in wondering. Her youngest sister's wedding was set for the very start of summer. When she woke on the day of the festivities, Isabel set her troubles aside. Tomorrow she would worry and scheme. Today she would smile and weep only happy tears. She would dress in green satin and lay a wreath of hellebore in her hair. She was watching the wedding party with a pinned-on smile when a young man approached her. He was a cousin of the groom, with the same warm eyes and green-rinsed hair. She'd heard it said that their mother's mother had been scooped by her husband from the sea. He held out a hand. "Will you dance?" Isabel hadn't danced since the night her broken feet painted roses over the snow, but she let him lead her into the crowd, counting her quickening breaths as they spun, smiling back when he pulled a blossom from her hair and kissed it, laughing when he lifted her in tandem with the other dancers, his hands on her waist, light as water. She danced with him a second time, a third. I could do it, she thought, letting him brush his lips over her fingers, then her palm, then her mouth. It would be no hardship to let this man win her. He was finely made. He stood solid on the earth, and he could protect her from other entanglements. When the suitor from below the stairwell came to claim her, she would show him another man's ring on her finger. No one need know she'd nearly been tricked into giving herself away. All went as she hoped. The young man visited her the day after the wedding, and every day after that. He was the son of a shipwright, with a quick laugh and gentle manners, easy to like. When he asked for her hand, she gave it to him gladly, feeling her neck slip free of the snow. In her father's hall, they toasted the engagement. Late that night, tipsy and triumphant, she ascended the stairs alone. Did she imagine the shadows that lay drift deep beneath each step? Were there more stairs than there ought to be, carrying her up and up until, panting, she reached the landing at last? In her room, she moved quickly to the mirror, finding in it her hand and its engagement ring. Her breathing settled as she looked at the ring's reflection, lifting her fingers to admire its light. Inside the mirror's watery oval, the stone wriggled from its setting. It shuddered and stretched damp wings, becoming a pale moth that rose to tangle itself in her hair. When her mother rushed in, drawn by Isabel's screams, she found her daughter doubled over, clawing at her head. There was nothing in there that the older woman could see. The engagement ring shone, unchanged, from her daughter's finger. Isabel told her betrothed they must be married at once, that very day. He said it was impossible. He and his father must sail down the coast to deliver a ship to a king. He would travel home on horseback, in time for them to be wed before winter. "Return to me before the first snow falls," she told him, "or it will go badly for us." He smiled to soothe her worries, kissed her, and went away. In the quiet left by his absence, she learned he was more than an escape from a tightening knot. She had come to love him. But her love was harried by the suitor below the stairs. Unseen hands left moldering roses on her pillow. The ivory skeleton of a songbird appeared in pieces at the bottom of her soup bowl. One night she woke to the sound of hissing laughter and the phantom feeling of fingers on her skin, and found a necklace of woven metal branches wrapped tightly around her throat. She suffered without speaking, and her family smiled to see it, calling her lovesick. Summer ripened, then rotted. The heat broke, and it was autumn. With the new season came a dead weasel at the foot of her bed, its long body wrapped in white satin, a fox's paw in her left dancing shoe. She disposed of the weasel and threw the paw on the fire. The leaves crackled into sunburned collars, and the preparations for her wedding to the shipwright's son had heightened. On the day her bridal dress was delivered, a rat's grey pelt fell from its folds. At last she received word from her betrothed that he was on his way home. Business had gone better than expected. They could still be married without delay. It was autumn still. Late autumn, but warm. The skies clear and freckled with the falling bodies of leaves. She would marry her love before the snow fell, and be safe. Their wedding day dawned pale. The clouds' bellies hung low, and the breezes blew cold. Isabel's mother lit lamps, chiding her daughter for standing at the window watching the sky. The wedding guests arrived, and Isabel was dressed in white lace, made to move among them. Whenever she could, she looked out at the yard. It was nearly dark when her fiancé arrived on the back of a steaming horse. She ran to him, her dress dragging behind her. Muddy-hemmed and panting, she reached up to seize his hands. Before they could touch, the clouds gave way, letting fall the winter's first snow. Quickly, Isabel pulled him through the yard, into the house, past their drunken guests. He was laughing at first, then not, as she led him to the judge, who sat with a wine-glass in one hand and a cake plate on his knee. "Marry us," she told him. "My mother isn't here yet," protested her fiancé. "I must finish my wine," the judge said sourly. A knocking came at the door. "Perhaps that's my mother now," her betrothed murmured. The judge swallowed the last of his drink. "Stop!" Isabel cried, but her father was already opening the door. Through it came a crowd of figures in bridesmaids' gowns, their hands gloved and their slippers trailing yellow ribbons. Their wooden masks were painted with joyful faces, and circlets of lilies crowned their pointed ears. One bridesmaid was dressed more lavishly than the rest, in velvet adorned with tiny mirrors that threw sequins of light over the guests. She walked to the room center, lifted a fiddle to her chin, and began to play. The music wound round the guests like piano wire. though Isabel tugged at the hands of her betrothed and the arms of her sisters. Though she pleaded in her mother's ear, they would not look at her. They only gazed at the masked girls dancing prettily as marionettes. The fiddler's song spun wilder, till the wedding party's entrancement turned to toes-tapping, and the fox girls whirled among the guests, drawing them into the dance. When the fiddler dropped her instrument, the thing played itself. Perched against an empty chair, she took the hands of the bridegroom. Isabel stood alone in the room, swaying with masked dancers and smiling guests. They were drunk and glad. They laughed with the pleasure right up until the moment the bridesmaids pulled off their masks, revealing the pointed faces of foxes, and using their shining teeth to rip out the wedding guests' throats. Off came their heads. They looked happy as they fell, but surprised when they landed. Isabel rushed to where her beloved's head had fallen. She leaned down to kiss its lips, weeping as the fox girls seized her up and carried her away. The long staircase was not as she remembered it. Gone were its polished steps, given way to rough wooden boards, weeping splinters. The paintings were transformed. Now the women in them consorted with long-tailed beasts, and the men carried their own skins over their shoulders. The gold and silver grove had become a thornwood that tore at Isabel's skin and hair and wedding dress. When they reached the house beyond the woods, her dress was in rags. The once beautiful house was a ruin, its halls scattered with the bones of small creatures, and its ceiling porous as cheese. The fox girls bore the bride to a dusty room where a wooden altar awaited. Its boards were stained, and the brown snail curl of a dried orange blossom clung to its front. "Make your preparations," said the fox girl in the mirrored gown. "Your husband-to-be is on his way." Isabel held up trembling hands, still stained with her fiancé's blood. "If he tries to keep me, I swear by my eyes I will make his life a torment." The fox tisked scornfully. "You'll only be his bride of an hour. It's not your company he longs for, it's your blood. Just as flowers wilt for want of water, this house and its grounds thirst and fade without maiden's blood. It is my master's fancy to seduce him and marry its meals. After his realm feasts on you, it will return for another year to its splendor." The fox laughed its coarse laugh, showing the blood caught on its pointed teeth. All the foxes had shed their wedding clothes. Now they dropped to the floor and trotted away, locking the room behind them. When they were gone, Isabel rattled the door. She stood on her toes to peer out the narrow windows. When she looked back toward the altar, a woman was sitting there, white-dressed and russet-haired, turning her golden lioness mask in flimsy fingers. "I will wait with you," said the wicked wife, "until he comes." Isabel could not speak a whisper. "You are to blame for this. You, the wicked wife." "I was a wife, it's true, his very first, but it's only in the mouths of tale-tellers that I've become wicked." "You baited me. You gave me to him." The ghost's bent neck spoke regret, but her voice was steady. "I was the bait only, not the hook." "Then help me. Don't wait with me for death to come. Let me escape it." The ghostly bride opened her mouth as if to speak, but flickering, it did not. Instead, her misty body drew in on itself. It shrank into the form of a white dagger, which darted towards the door and rattled through the rusty keyhole, shaking the wood in its frame. When Isabel tried the door again, she found it unlocked. Alone, she wandered through her suitor's house. It was like the carcass of a dead beast. Its rancid rooms picked rib cages or the chambers of a broken heart. As she walked through a ballroom with blackened walls, Isabel spied a column of ghostly light. The wicked wife hooked a finger at her to follow. She trailed the ghost through rooms that bubbled with decay, to a staircase made of cloudy rose quartz. The living bride followed the dead one up the stairs, stepping over the places where they'd crumbled. They ended in a door that opened onto a large chamber. Isabel knew by of its odor, dirty sheets and vetiver, that it belonged to the suitor. Instead of a bed, there was a nest of silken pelts. A mirror hung on a hook, and on a hat stand a wardrobe of wooden masks, each painted with a different face. Against one wall, an enormous bound chest that was held in its place by roots spangling down through the ceiling. Isabel trembled to think what might lie inside it, but when she lifted the lid, she saw neither bloody flesh nor a cracked bone. The chest was full of trinkets, some so old they were nearly dust, and some quite new. A carding comb, a cloak of grey wool, a needle stuck into a spool of thread, a little clockwork cat with 3 tails. The withered crown of Hellborn made her pause, but it wasn't until she saw her own braided bracelet and vanished blue glove that she understood. They were keepsakes, trophies perhaps, of Isabel and all the brides who'd come before her. She closed her weary eyes. The hungry house breathed around her, so certain it had her in its grasp, and she remembered a far-off day when 3 sisters let their blood feed a sleeping briar. Seeds, she thought. All the stolen oddments planted in this chest, they were seeds. The roots that grew from the chest burrowed through an acre of earth and into a wild garden, where they showed their faces as a thicket of briars. This was the grave of the wicked wife, of all the wicked suitors' blameless wives, planted with the things they'd once held dear. The blood that warmed her cheek seemed to speak to her, or maybe it was the wicked wife who whispered in her ear, "Let loose your blood, bleed into this chest as you did on the briars." The needle in its spool of thread winked at her. Isabel took it up and stuck it into the tips of her fingers, letting her blood fall onto the contents of the open chest. As the blood dripped down, she heard a growling from below. As the things in the chest drank it up, there came a heavy footstep on the stair. As the stolen trinket shuddered, a great howling came from outside the door. The suitor bounded into the room, crouched like a beast in a torn velvet coat. When he flung aside his mask, he had a lion's face, pupils drawn tight, and dried blood on his muzzle. He made to leap at Isabel, but it was too late. From each trinket sprang a ghost, with broken bones and blood-silver throats, and the chests carved hollow, their eyes glistening like gems in a wedding ring. They smiled at the bristling lion, their teeth for a moment sharp as foxes. Then they descended, their dead hands given form by Isabel's blood. She watched as the brides took their revenge. From below came the howling of the fox girls, as a host of brides darted down the steps to make short work of them too. In the quiet that followed this bloody time, the ghosts gathered around Isabel. "Take my cloak," said one. "Take my key," said another. "Take my needle and thread," whispered a third. "It is not too late." And they evanesced into the fragrant air. When the last had disappeared, a rumbling shook the room. From the chest, Isabel seized the needle and thread, the cloak and the key, and fled. The house went to pieces as she ran. The cloak protected her from all manner of disaster, falling masonry and fast-crawling rot and devouring lines of blue fire. When she reached the house front door, the key unlocked it. Fast through the thornwood, her cloak blunting its attack, and up the staircase. All the people in the paintings were dead, the steps scorched dark. When Isabel reached her own front hall, the carnage of her wedding party awaited. She walked among the broken bodies, her mother and father, her sisters in their gowns, her betrothed with the sea-washed hair. She set aside her grief and picked up the needle and thread. It took a long time to fit each head to its proper body. It took longer to sew them back on. Her fingers slipped and the needle pierced her, and her blood mixed with the blood of the dead. She worked in awful solitude for a day and a night, shuddering to think she might run out of thread. As the sun rose on the second morning after what should have been her wedding day, she used the last inch of it to sew up the throat of the judge. A wedding party of stitch-necked bodies lay about her, limbs slack and mouths silent. She did not know what came next. The dead brides had given her no instructions. She thought a while, then kneeled over her betrothed and pressed her cracked lips to his. A moment passed, still a stone. Then he breathed and sighed and cried out. From all around them came the shouts of awakening wedding guests, who remembered nothing after the flash of fox eyes, the sudden tearing of flesh. Wrapped in bloodied finery, by the light of the season's first snow, Isabel and her beloved were wed. The stitches over his throat remained forever as a symbol of his wife's devotion, and her own thornwood scars never quite faded, as a reminder not to trust the touch of a masked man.